Okay, students, we're on chapter 27, the Cold War World, Global Politics, Economic Recovery, and Cultural Change. After World War II, Europe was left in a very confused state economically. They were almost totally destroyed by the Allies. And to give you some indication, this is what the city of Dresden, Germany looked like at the time. Bombing during the day, bombing at night to bring Germany to its knees, which eventually happened on May 8th, May 7th, 1945. It was May 8th, 1945. They surrendered. Europe was a land of wreckage and confusion. Refugees returned home to very little. Housing was scarce. Food was in short supply. There was a trauma, the brutality of the war. There were civil wars that were breaking out in other parts of Europe, and there was liberation and betrayal as far as the people in Eastern Europe were concerned, because when the Soviets went into Eastern Europe, they basically made those countries communist countries. So again, they would have to deal with a dictator, although this time it was a little bit worse with Stalin without World War II. Recovery, government authority, functioning bureaucracies, legitimate legal systems and memories, the emergence of the superpowers and the Cold War, and the collapse of European empires. This is basically another photo that demonstrates the destruction of Germany, and it was 1945. Germany was laid waste because of the wholesale war that they had brought upon the world. This is a map of the territorial changes after World War II at the end of the Second World War. The Soviet Union annexed territory in Eastern Europe to create a buffer between it and Western Europe. At the same time, the United States established a series of military alliances in Western Europe to stifle the spread of communism in Europe. And so what we see is the Western powers are establishing this zone right here, and the Soviets are establishing these communist satellite states, is what they called, so that they would not be vulnerable to attack from the West. The Iron Curtain at Tehran and 1943 and Yalta 1945, the conferences are when at Tehran it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, and in Yalta in 1945 it was Churchill, Truman, and Stalin. The Soviets argued that they had a legitimate claim to Eastern Europe because of the suffering that their people had endured during the war. Churchill, Stalin, and the percentages of agreement, they divided Europe into spheres of influence. Now, you're going to have to read in your book because it explains it in a little bit more detail. These are just the highlights. So if you read in your book, chapter 27, it will basically tell you what exactly went on. Like I said, this is these are just the highlights. Okay, for the Soviets, Eastern Europe was a, quote, a sphere and a shield, end quote. Again, it was a buffer state between the Western states and Russia. The Soviets in Eastern Europe, they were known as the People's Republics, even though they were communist. Ladies and gentlemen, let me make this perfectly clear. Nothing good comes from a communist or socialist government. Okay? It has been an abject failure throughout history. It is one of oppression, repression, no freedoms whatsoever. You do everything they tell you to do. These People's Republics were sympathetic to Moscow, and one party took key positions of power. Okay, this is basically a Czech poster propaganda that celebrating the German defeat. There was a lot of this so that people could actually see that it was occurring. And behind this person, you have the American, British, Russian, and then you have the Czech flag. Czechoslovakia actually was lasted until 1989 when it became known as the Czech Republic after the fall of communism in Europe, in Russia. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946, he basically stated that an Iron Curtain had fallen across Europe and that they would have to work to contain communism, and later on we would see policies of containment as far as Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy were concerned, and that was to keep communism from spreading to other countries. That's how we became involved in Korea and Vietnam. Communist governments in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia by 1948. Yugoslavia was run by a guy named Marshal Tito, and he declared his government independent of Moscow in 1948, kind of ticked the Russians off. He drew support from the Serbs, Croats, and Muslims in Yugoslavia, and was expelled from the communist country's economic and military pacts because of it, even though Tito was still a communist. Soviet purges in the parties and administrations of the satellite governments began in the Balkans, which is Serbia and Bosnia, which we would later go to in the United States, UN in the early 1990s, extended through Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and Poland, and it renewed anti-Semitism. Now, what you have to realize is a lot of these people who survived concentration camps were leaving Germany. They were either refugees to the United States or they went to Israel because they understood that to be their homeland after the Balfour Declaration of 1917. They left too late. They were too late in leaving from Germany when the deportations had occurred, so they didn't go. But now was their chance. In Greece, there was a local communist-led resistance. The British and the United States determined to keep Greece in their sphere of influence. Greece is a touchstone for escalating American fear of communist expansion. And what occurred there was something that started actually during the German occupation of Greece. And, excuse me, so when the communists wanted to take over the country, it was kind of difficult because there was a lot of people that didn't want to go under another dictatorship. And eventually the Greek communists were defeated in Greece in the late 1940s. The two Germanys. There were 4 occupied zones between 2 hostile states. Berlin was divided in half, and there was only one road going in and out. And what happened was the Soviets blocked any food getting to the German people in Berlin. So that's when we start to see the Berlin airlift. 3 Western allies created a single government for their territories in 1948. They passed reforms to ease the economic crises and introduced a new currency. Soviets retaliated with the Berlin blockade between June 1948 and May 1949 that cut all roads, trains, and river access from the West Zone to West Berlin. So what happens is Berlin gets these 4 Allied zones, these 3 Allied zones and this 1 Soviet zone, and they're cut off from everybody. Well, how do you get supplies in? Well, you bring them in by airplane. The Berlin airlift brought in all this food now and supplies for the Germans. If not, it was part of the Marshall Plan. The German people would have starved to death. The Federal Republic was a democratic type republic in West Germany, and then you had the German Democratic Republic in East Germany, which was communist, which is anything but democratic. Now, when we look at this map, it shows you the division of the zones, and it also shows you where Berlin is within those zones. It's deep within East Germany, but it was still, it was still part of Germany as a whole. In the summer of 1948, the Soviet Union blocked those routes through German Democratic Republic to the western zones of Berlin. The blockade exacerbated tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States and forced the Allies to airlift supplies to West Berlin. At one point, planes landed in Berlin every 3 minutes. So they're bringing in all this food, and it's all part of the Marshall Plan. George Marshall, who was the chief of staff, who was the chief of staff, formulated this Marshall Plan where Governments that kind of went against the communists would be supported by the Allies and the United States. The Marshall Plan, there it is. The U.S. response to Soviet expansion, it was and basically massive economic and military aid. Well, excuse me. Roosevelt had passed away in 1945, and Truman was his vice president. So he succeeded Roosevelt, and he came up with the Truman Doctrine, where military assistance was given to anti-communists in Greece, and it tied the contest for political power to economics. Now, what does this do? It basically brought it was a policy of containment, keep the communists from spreading, and that was the Truman Doctrine in 1947, because we were seeing things all over the planet. Excuse me. Oh. Anyway, so that's what it was. It was a policy of containment to keep the communists where they were and to keep it from spreading any further. The Marshall Plan was $13 billion of aid for industrial development over 4 years. It encouraged states to diagnose their own problems and develop solutions. It was founded on the idea of coordination between the other democratic Western European countries and the building block of future European unity. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is where we start to see each side start to pick who they're going to side with. The United States, Canada, and representative from Western European states, Greece, Turkey, and West Germany were added later. It was to protect against armed attack against one, if it was an armed attack against all. It was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And Eisenhower would be its supreme military commander. We would later see this go as the UN. The UN would later become what they call peacekeeping forces. But the UN's kind of gone rogue within the last 25 years. They developed a plan for depopulation, believe it or not. Anyway, I digress. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the Supreme Allied Commander in the European theater, became the senior commander for NATO. And this is the membership of NATO. Now, what the Eastern Pact nations did on Russia's side was they formed what was called the Warsaw Pact, which was basically the same thing. It protected them against attack by any of the Western nations, and if one were attacked, then all of them were attacked, and they had to come to each other. So it's kind of like that the alliance system that occurred prior to World War I. There was two worlds in the race for the bomb. The Soviet response was the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, COMCON, and the Communist Information Bureau, Cominform, 1947. And 6 years after NATO was formed, they formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955 with Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and East Germany, all communist states. The Soviets tested their first atomic bomb in 1949. The United States actually used their atomic bombs against Japan, the first one on August 6th on Hiroshima and August 9th on Nagasaki, demonstrating the power of the atomic bomb. The Soviets and the United States both had the hydrogen bomb in 1953. It was 1,000 more times more powerful than the Hiroshima explosion. Now, if you've ever seen a film of that, that is incredible. Intercontinental ballistic missiles and delivery systems on how to do that. So now we start to see this huge arms race build up. We didn't tell the Soviets we were developing it because we knew that people would try to steal those secrets. We had atomic-powered submarines, which didn't need fuel. They could actually use nuclear reactors to power them. They didn't have to come up and charge their batteries. They could stay underwater for months at a time. The nuclearization of warfare polarized the Cold War, and it forced other countries to join the United States or the Soviets because it generated fears that local conflicts might trigger a general war. We haven't had a nuclear war yet, really. The bomb is a symbol of an age. It was science, technology, and progress. And it was a threat of mass destruction. Not necessarily mass destruction, but mutually assured destruction. Because if Russia fired one missile, then we would fire one in retaliation. And nobody wins in those things. They'd go through what they call nuclear winter, where there's radioactivity all over the place. Was the Cold War inevitable? Stalin's ambitions fueled the Cold War. Now, what does the Cold War mean? The Cold War means that you have two hostile powers. The United States and Soviet Union emerged from World War II as what we know as superpowers. The Spanish-American War made the United States a world power. World War I made us a global power, and in World War II made us a superpower. So Cold War was, each side didn't fight each other directly, but there were proxy wars where they would support different wars occurring around the world, which is what happened in Korea and Vietnam and other countries around the world. The Soviets were supporting the communists, and the United States was supporting those free forces. The United States feared Soviet expansion. They were unwilling to give up military, economic, or political power. Trust was impossible. A New Balance of Power, George Kennan and the Policy of Containment. And I spoke of the Policy of Containment. Your book goes into George Kennan a little bit more in depth. There was a domestic intensification of the Cold War. There was anxiety, air raid drills, spy trials, and the menacing other. I remember when I was in elementary school. Now this is, back in the, mid to late 60s. We had air raid drills. We had to get under our desks, okay? And a lot of schools were air raid shelters. Well, during a nuclear explosion, that's not really going to help you any, okay? But they made us do that, and it was very scary to do that. There were a lot of spy trials in the 1950s. The Rosenbergs were two people that allegedly were giving secrets to the Russians. Khrushchev and the thaw. Well, Nikita Khrushchev comes to power after the death of Stalin in March 1953. He comes to power, and he agreed to a summit with Britain, France, and the United States. Well, when Stalin was in power, it was all about dominate, dominate, dominate. When Khrushchev came to power, it's about let's see if we can negotiate something. The secret speech in 1956 by Nikita Khrushchev denied Stalinist excesses. Stalin was a dictator. Stalin killed a lot of military officers because he was paranoid that they were going to overthrow him, and he just did not, was not a nice guy, okay? He allowed Khrushchev also killed a lot of his citizens through starving them to death, by the way. Allowed rehabilitation of some of Stalin's victims, and they were de-Stalinizing the Soviet Union, which means they were removing statues of Stalin and putting them in warehouses. The thaw between 1956 and 1958 was camps released thousands of prisoners, and the rehabilitation of relatives of those or executed imprisoned under Stalin. They had what they call gulags, which were these camps out in the middle of nowhere, and you know how cold Russia gets. And they would send these people out there basically to die, and they would say they were enemies of the state. Cultural expression was freed up. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was an author. He wrote a book called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich in 1962, The First Circle, and then the Gulag Archipelago in 1973. Well, he was arrested and then exiled. So, because he kind of went too far. There was a letting up in cultural expression, but Solzhenitsyn went a little bit far. Repression in Eastern Europe. East German government faced economic crisis in 1953. 58,000 East Germans left for the West. There were strikes and unrest, and Walter Ulbricht used fears of disorder to solidify one-party rule in Eastern Europe, specifically East Germany. Poland. There were demands for more independence to manage their own economy. The government responded with military repression and promises of liberalization, which never occurred. Władysław Gomulka pledged Poland's loyalty to the Warsaw Pact, which means he betrayed his people and became a full-fledged communist. In Hungary, Imre Nagy was a nationalist and communist. Much broader anti-communist struggle. He wanted to leave the Warsaw Pact, but Soviet troops entered Budapest on November 4th, 1956 in tanks and kind of forced him to back down. You would too if you saw T-34 tanks rolling down your street. Hungarian citizens resorted to street fighting. The Soviets installed their own puppet leader by the name of János Kadar. He was a staunch Moscow communist and continued to repress his people. Khrushchev and the peaceful coexistence. NATO placed nuclear weapons in West Germany. The East Germans continued to flee, 2.7 million, between 1949 and 1961. So what do you do with all these people that are fleeing the East? They're joining people in the West. Khrushchev demanded a permanent division of Germany with the Free City of Berlin. The Berlin Wall was built. Now, the Berlin Wall looked like this. It was just, at first, it was just barbed wire and little blocks. They used to call them Rummel's asparagus. They used them and they it was like pieces of steel that were welded together. Well, then they finally decided to build the Berlin Wall. And this is what the Berlin Wall looked like. And people were still going over the wall. There were tunnels going under the wall. People still escaped. But they didn't do so easily. They couldn't just run across the border. And people were actually shot trying to escape with the Berlin Wall being built. It wouldn't come down until 1989. So it was up for about 28 years. The economic miracle. War provided technologies with practical and immediate applications. It improved communications. There was a manufacture of synthetic materials, aluminum and alloy steels. There were advances in technology of prefabrication. And there was high consumer demand and high levels of employment. The role of the government was the necessity of planning. West Germany provided tax breaks to encourage business investment. Outside businesses come in and they say, well, the taxes are real low here. Let's go ahead and build a plant here. And that's what you use to bring businesses to West Germany. Britain and Italy offered investment allowances for any companies that were investing in Europe at the time. Now, there were broad experiments with the nationalization of industry and services, mixed economies providing public and private ownership. In France, electricity, gas, banking, radio, television, and auto industry, radio, television, and auto industry, okay? So they wanted to nationalize a lot of these things. They wound up nationalizing healthcare and making it socialized healthcare. Hang on one second. And when they did that, it's basically causing people to wait in lines. You can't choose your doctor. You have to go where the government tells you to go. And they still have that in Great Britain, France, Germany, socialized medicine. That's why a lot of people, in Canada too, that's why a lot of people, they come to the United States because they get to pick their doctors. And sometimes you have to wait 4 or 5 months for surgeries that need to be done. In Britain, coal, utilities, road and rail transport, and banking are nationalized. West Germany experienced unprecedented economic growth while the East did not grow at all because they were under communist rule. Production increased sixfold. Unemployment reached 0.4%, which is very low in West Germany. New housing units are built, and the German demand for labor attracted foreign workers. That's how they got all these foreign workers in their country right now. Excuse me, because they came, stayed, and raised families and told other people to come. In France, the government played a direct role in industrial reform, capital, expertise, shifts in the national labor pool, priority to basic industries. In Italy, there were heavy subsidies from the Marshall Plan. The Americans were paying for Italy to do this. Olivetti, Fiat was a car maker, and Pirelli became household names. These were all car makers. By 1954, real wages 50% higher than they had been in 1938. Poverty continued to remain high in the agrarian South, and always would be in Italy. It had been that way for a long time. Northern Italians considered Southern Italians to be slightly barbaric and kind of white trash and things of that nature. It still goes on to this day, but once the Italian immigrants came to the United States back in the 19th century, it was still there. Okay, Britain. Harold Macmillan, you never had it so good. In 1959, the economy remained sluggish. There were obsolete factories and methods, and there was an unwillingness to adopt new techniques. Britain basically takes a long time to adapt and overcome. European economic integration, European Coal and the Steel Community, the ECSC, 1951. Coal accounted for 82% of Europe's primary energy consumption, key to relations between West Germany and France. The European Economic Community, the EEC, or the Common Market, included France, West Germany, Italy, Britain, Holland, and Luxembourg. There was an abolition of trade barriers, a commitment to common external tariffs, the free movement of labor, and a unified wage structure and social security system. Well, this leads to the economic union, which has been a total disaster for the last 30 years. Because when you have an abolition of trade barriers and the free movement of labor, that means that there are no borders, so there's no sovereignty for any particular country. And that's a dangerous thing. The Eurocrats, Britain, feared effects of ECSC on declining coal industry, continued to rely on economic relations with the Empire and Commonwealth. The EEC became the world's largest exporter in 1963. Total production was 70% higher than it had been in 1950. When you export more than you import, you make money. That's the ancient form of mercantilism, okay, that we talked about in the Age of Absolutism at the very beginning of the semester. Bretton Woods in July 1944 aimed to coordinate movements of the global economy, created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, all currencies pegged to the dollar. Now, this system is being dismantled as we speak, because basically what it did was it created debt. Everyone went into debt, and we became debt slaves to the debt. So this system is currently being phased out because we moved to the petrodollar, which is the dollar backed by petroleum in the 1970s. Well, now we're moving to asset backed, which means there's an asset, there's something that we own that backs the value of our money. So this is what occurred in the 1940s. And this International Monetary Fund was a way to control people. And the World Bank was a way to control people. And nations, they lent money to nations that they knew they couldn't pay back. Economic development in Eastern Europe, national income rose and output increased. Poland and Hungary strengthened their economic connections with the West. 30% of Eastern Europe trade was done outside of the Soviet bloc in the 1970s. So the communist countries were trading with the Western democracies, you see, because they knew they couldn't survive that way. Comcon compelled other members to trade with the Soviet Union. Well, what does the Soviet Union have, really? Now they have natural gas. The welfare state. Economic expansion promised more comprehensive social programs. Welfare state was coined by Clement Attlee of the British Labour Party. He succeeded Churchill. Britain, they had free medical health care through the National Health Service, assistance to families, and guaranteed secondary education. Now, let me explain to you what this is. Free medical health care through the National Health Service is socialized medicine. It's not free, ladies and gentlemen. Taxes are very, very high in the in Britain and in Europe, as a matter of fact. And the reason for that is somebody's got to pay for these services. Assistance to family and guaranteed secondary education. You want to go to college? Doesn't cost you anything. But somebody pays for it. It's the taxpayer. Whereas you might pay, say, let's take a very lenient tax percentage, 28% in taxes. In Great Britain, they pay 65% of everything they earn goes into paying taxes. Welfare relief as entitlement and not poor relief. Welfare is not an entitlement, ladies and gentlemen. It's a need, okay? It's not an entitlement. You are not entitled to it. T.H. Marshall, Social Rights and Social Democracy. European politics, pragmatism, okay? Konrad Adenauer became the West German chancellor in 1949, and he despised German militarism. He remained apprehensive about German parliamentary government because people were scared or feared that there would be another rise of like a Nazi party if things got too bad again. General Charles de Gaulle in the Fifth French Republic, he retired from politics in 1946. He returned to office after the Algerian War of 1958, insisted on a new constitution, strengthened the executive branch of government, and France withdrew from NATO in 1966. Now, recently, when President Trump became president, he went over to NATO and he said, look, you guys aren't paying for your own defense. The United States is paying for it. Well, now you're going to pay for it, which was a good thing because it was draining our treasury so much. And that's why a lot of people don't like him, because he's making them pay for things that they should have been paying for all along. One of the reasons. Cultivated better relations with the Soviet Union, modern military establishment with atomic weapons. In the third world, avoiding alignment with either superpower, there was the Chinese, what they called the Cultural Revolution of 1949 under Mao Zedong. And there was a civil war in 1926, but that was never resolved. And there was a guy by the name of Chiang Kai-shek who was a nationalist. He believed in democratic ways of doing things. But Mao Zedong was a communist. And in 1949, the communists gained power in China. And they still hold it today. They're called the Chi-Coms. Okay, under Xi Jinping, I think his name is. Or Xi is his name. And he's a communist. And basically during the Cultural Revolution, people were, quote, re-educated, end quote, which means they were sent to work camps and re-educated in communism and bombarded 24 hours a day with the wonders of communism and how it brings people together. What they don't tell you is if you don't believe what they believe, they put a bullet in the back of your head. And even though a lot of people, and I see this a lot with a lot of students that believe socialism and communism is the way to go, that's what they were taught in college. Okay? I'm here to tell you communism sucks, and so does socialism. All right? Look around you. Look at the nations that are in communist control. Cuba, China. China ain't throw you in jail for anything. You disappear. All right? North Korea. They throw you in jail for nothing. You disappear. Vietnam, they throw you in jail for nothing. You disappear. It's not freedom. Not by a long shot. Nationalists and communists defeated Japan. Mao refused to surrender his northern provinces. U.S. intervention, the revolution, was an act of a nation of peasants. Mao adopted Marxism to Chinese conditions, and the loss of China provoked fear in the West. There's 2 billion people in China. If they went communist, that was a problem because they were almost as big as Russia or Soviet Union. United States considered China and the Soviet Union to be a communist bloc. Proxy wars begin to happen. The Korean War, the Korean Peninsula, they were once, they wanted their independence, but they wanted to be communist, and the North Koreans wanted to take over the South Koreans so that the whole country would be communist. Cold War hotspot. Korea was under Japanese control during World War II. Post-1945, the Soviets controlled the North, Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong II, and the United States controlled South Korea, Syngman Rhee. North Korean troops attacked across the border in June 1950. I could tell you this is one hell of a war, a conflict. I actually interviewed a couple of people that were there, a couple of gentlemen who had served in Korea, saying it was a hellhole. It's cold, constantly under attack, difficult. A lot of their friends were killed. The United States brought the invasion to the attention of the UN Security Council. the UN permitted an American-led police action, which means you go in, it's not really a war, but you go in and you keep the peace. General Douglas MacArthur, who was a famous general from World War II, was the former military governor of occupied Japan. He led an amphibious assault behind North Korean lines, which was absolutely brilliant. He wanted to press an assault into China, but President Truman said, "You want 1 billion Chinese coming down on these troops in Korea?" And he didn't want to listen to what President Truman said. In fact, MacArthur wanted to use what was known as tactical nuclear weapons, which are very small nuclear weapons, to defeat the communists in North Korea. But Truman fired him and later promoted a guy by the name of Mark Clark to his position. Chinese troops supported the North Koreans. It was a stalemate. The Korean conflict ended in June 1953, and Korea remained divided along the 38th parallel. Decolonization. A lot of these countries in Asia wanted to be decolonized, basically kicking out the European powers that had colonized them to begin with. The decline of older empires, nationalist movements, and independence. The British Empire unravels after a little over 100 years of control. In India, post-1945, waves of Indian protests for Britain to quit India, to leave it. Originally, all the kings and queens of England, after India was, I'm going to say, subjugated under British rule, whenever the titles would be announced, it would be the King of England and Emperor or Empress of India. This is the Middle East. There was a lot of decolonization in the Middle East. It actually, was there after World War I. Great Britain was in Palestine. They left. There was a conflict there. The French were in Africa, North Africa, Algeria. And if you look and see at the map from the legend down here, you'll see that there was a lot of colonization before them because they could provide products, specifically oil, okay, in the Middle East. Mohandas K. Gandhi pioneered anti-colonial ideas and tactics, and he advocated Swaraj, which is self-rule, nonviolence, and civil disobedience, which is basically the tactic that Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement adopted, civil disobedience. Jawaharlal Nehru led the pro-independence Congress Party. There was ethnic and religious conflict because in India you have Hindus and Muslims, and of course we know Muslims don't really like infidels, and those are people who don't follow Islam. British India partitioned into India. Majority was Hindu, and Pakistan, majority Muslim. There was brutal religious and ethnic warfare. Gandhi was assassinated in January 1948, and Nehru becomes the Prime Minister of India. He had a program of industrialization and modernization and steered a course of non-alignment with the United States and the Soviet Union. Right now, India loves the United States, believe it or not. And, they eliminated the caste system. Now, what is a caste system? Well, it's basically if you're born poor, you stay poor. And if you're born rich, you stay rich. The poor people in India had been known for thousands of years as the untouchables because they were on the bottom scale of a caste system. Now, the difference between a caste system and a class system is in a class system, you can be born poor and work your way up. Okay? So the caste system was eliminated after 1947 in India by Nehru. Palestine. We're going to go back to that. That's present-day Israel. The Balfour Declaration, 1917, promised a Jewish homeland in Palestine for European Zionists, which are Jewish people. Rising conflict between the Jewish settlers and the Arabs in the 1930s, and the British limited further immigration in 1939. But after the war was over, they let people in. And in 1948, Palestine became the state of Israel, the Jewish state of Israel. This talks about decolonization in Asia. Vietnam is going to become a concern a little bit later on, because they were first known as French Indochina, and then after World War II, a leader arose by the name of Ho Chi Minh, who had studied in Paris. He was a Marxist, and he wanted all of Vietnam to become a Marxist. Well, because of this policy of containment that the United States had, after the French pulled out, the United States took over in attempting to keep South Vietnam out of the hands of the North Vietnamese communists. A three-way war. There were Palestinian Arabs who fight for land and independence. There were Jewish settlers determined to defy British rule, and British administrators had divided sympathies. The United Nations partitioned the territory in two states. Israel declared its independence in May 1948, and that's when they become an independent nation. However, they still had Muslims in that country. How they dealt with them was they crushed them, and they still do in Israel. Palestinian Arabs clustered in refugee camps. There was the Gaza Strip and the West Bank of the Jordan River. Those are settlements of Arabs in Israel. Israel was recognized by the United States and the Soviet Union. In Africa, there were several African colonies that moved toward independence. Britain left constitutions and a legal system, but no economic support. Ghana was seen as a model for free African nations in 1960. There were more African colonies gained independence. They could not redress losses from colonialism. There was the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya, where there was killing of civilians, and the British set up internment camps. The British tolerated apartheid. Now, what is apartheid? Apartheid is legalized discrimination in South Africa. The whites were a minority, but they still controlled the blacks through apartheid. It required Africans to live in designated homelands. It forbade Africans to travel without permits. The management of labor. It banned political protest. And then Rhodesia declared its independence in 1945 from colonial powers. There was a crisis in the Suez Canal area and the end of an era. The British found the cost of maintaining naval and air bases too high. They protected oil-rich states of the Middle East. Nationalists forced the British to withdraw troops from Egypt within 3 years. The British had been there for a long time. King Farouk, deposed by nationalist officers, and a republic is proclaimed in 1952. Gamal Abdel Nasser became the Egyptian president, and he nationalized the Suez Canal Company, financing the Aswan Dam. And there was this wave of pan-Arabism where people took a great deal of pride in being Arabs, willing to take aid and support from the Soviets, which means that the democratic countries would not be able to get any type of influence in that area. So what happens is Nasser brings this revival of Islam into Egypt. Israel, France, and Britain found pan-Arabism threatening. Egypt attacked Israel, France, and Britain in 1956. The United States inflicted financial penalties on Great Britain and France, and they were forced to withdraw. They said, basically, this is a Middle East war. Stay out of it, is what they told them. Okay? French decolonization. The French experience. Decolonization was bloodier, more difficult, and more damaging to French prestige. The First Vietnam War took place in 1956 to 1954. The French had colonized Indochina in the 1880s, and it was one of France's last imperial acquisitions. There was nationalist and communist independence movements that were in Vietnam at that time. Ho Chi Minh, as I explained before, hoped for independence at Versailles in 1919, but it didn't come. Marxist peasants organized around social, agrarian, and national issues. The Allies supported communist independence movement. Vietnamese guerrilla war against the French. The French pressed on for total victory. They established a base at Dien Bien Phu, which fell to the communists in May 1954, and the French began peace talks at Geneva, and the Geneva Accords ended that war between the French and the North Vietnamese communists. However, Indochina was divided into four countries. North Vietnam, which was taken over by Ho Chi Minh's party. South Vietnam, which was taken over by pro-Western politicians. And there was a virtual guarantee that war would continue because the North was going to be very aggressive. North Vietnam. In Algeria, since the 1830s, it was a settler state of three social groups. It had 1 million Europeans, farmers, vintners, working-class small merchants, Muslim Berbers, formal and informal privileges, and Muslim Arabs was the largest and the most deprived sector in Algeria. Post-1945, Algerian nationalists called on the Allies to recognize their independence. There were public demonstrations, violence against settlers, French repression, and France granted limited enfranchisement for settlers and Berber Muslims and Muslim. Now, enfranchisement means giving them the right to vote. Arab activists formed the National Liberation Front in the mid-1950s. There's a civil war on many fronts. There's a guerrilla war between regular French army and the Liberation Front and the FLM terrorism in Algerian cities. And there was systematic torture by French security forces. I guess the French were trying to hang on to Algeria as best they could. De Gaulle declared that Algeria would always be French. Algeria declared its independence by referendum in 1962. The war divided French society, and there was the identity of being French and not Muslim. The black presence, the présence africaine, Aimé Césaire and Léopold Senghor, both men were exponents of what's known as negritude, which is black consciousness. Assimilation was a failure, and powerful indictments of colonialism. Now, this had to do with Africa. It didn't have to do with the United States yet. Frantz Fanon, withdrawal into black culture was not an answer to racism. There was a theory of radical social change. He wrote Black Skin, White Masks and The Wretched of the Earth, 1961, and basically told of the blacks' treatment in Africa by colonial powers. Pointed to the ironies of Europe's civilizing mission, the re-evaluation of blackness, existentialism. Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus advocated individuality, commitment, and choice. We start to see this movement. It's kind of like a freedom of the mind movement rather than a freedom of the flesh. Existence precedes essence. Meaning in life is not given, it is created. Individuals are condemned to be free. Bad faith is denying one's freedom. Albert Camus wrote a book called The Stranger. I read that one in one of my English novel classes. It's a pretty good book. In French, it's called L'Étranger. The Plague in 1947 and The Fall in 1956. Existentialism and race. Race-derived meaning from lived experience. Simone de Beauvoir wrote The Second Sex. One is not born a woman, one becomes a woman. Asked why women dream the dreams of men. Marx, Freud, and The Woman Question was in that particular work. Memory and amnesia, the aftermath of war. Individual helplessness in the face of state power. George Orwell wrote 2 books, Animal Farm, which is about collectivization, and 1984, which basically is what we're living through. We're being told what to do and when to do it as far as this epidemic is concerned. Samuel Beckett wrote Waiting for Godot. Harold Pinter wrote The Caretaker and The Homecoming. He basically viewed what the aftermath of war and power. George Orwell wrote about this classless, well, not classless society. It was a dictatorial society in 1984. J.R.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. Everybody should be familiar with that. Lord of the Rings. He wrote the books. The Frankfurt School. Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, Indictment of the Culture Industry for Depolarizing the Masses, Divide and Conquer. Hannah Arendt, Nazism and Stalinism should be understood as a form of totalitarianism, and she wrote, which they are. The Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951 is what she wrote. Totalitarianism worked by mobilizing mass support. Of course, we saw that in Nazi Germany. You get mass support for a common cause, and you blame one ethnic group for your problems. Use terror to crush resistance. The brown shirts, of course. The atomization of the public and made collective resistance impossible. Why? There are spies everywhere. Let me give you an example, ladies and gentlemen. This past Thanksgiving, California. People in that state were encouraged to inform on their neighbors if they had more than 10 people over for Thanksgiving. Okay? That's why collective resistance is almost impossible in a totalitarian government, because your neighbors are ratting on you constantly. Eichmann in Jerusalem refused to demonize Nazism. Genocide is simply one more Nazi policy. Adolf Eichmann was the commandant of, I believe, the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp, and he was captured in South America, 1961, at a house on Garibaldi Street, and he was brought back to Israel to face trial for war crimes. He was convicted, sentenced to death. He was hanged. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered to the winds. I think this is, in this book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, I think if you look for a way to make Nazism accepted, I won't read your book because of what they did to this planet. Reaching a larger audience, Jerzy Kosinski, The Painted Bird, Czesław Miłosz, The Captive Mind, Gunter Grass, The Drum, and The Diary of Anne Frank. Now, if you've never, a lot of people have to read this in high school. If you've never read the book, it's outstanding. There have been a couple of remakes of the book. And one of them was in, I believe, the late 40s, early 1950s, which was absolutely incredible. And it talks about the resilience to survive. Anne Frank was a young Dutch girl that her family had to move into an attic to keep from being deported by the Germans. And finally, 1944, her family was deported. Only her father survived. Anne died in Auschwitz. And the place where they stayed is now a museum. You can go and see it. They were in that attic for 2 years. They couldn't leave. They couldn't talk during the day. They were confined in that one space. And you'd be amazed at what they do for survival. Repressing the past, war crimes and trials, few executions led to cynicism. Mythologizing the resistance movement, the Cold War, and the burying and distortion of memory. Conclusion, Fidel Castro comes to power in Cuba in 1959, Communist Revolution. The Bay of Pigs was a failed military operation that was launched by the CIA that failed. The Cuban Missile Crisis occurred in 1962 when the Russians, under Nikita Khrushchev, brought missiles and put them on Cuban soil, 90 miles from the United States coast. The Soviets eventually backed down because Kennedy told them, you move it or we're going to blockade you. And the military was on alert at that time. We thought we were actually going to war, and they eventually moved them. There was a movie made about it called Dr. Strangelove about that, and kind of satirized it as much as they could. Eisenhower, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, now we're not going to get to this in chapter 28, but he talked about the military-industrial complex. And these people make money. They make a lot of money if you invest in the military. And anybody that threatens that industrial complex is either marked for death or ruination. President Kennedy tried to. Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it does. A lot of the events surrounding his death sure are fishy. But he basically said of the CIA, he was going to break them into 1,000,000 pieces, into 1,000 pieces, and scatter them to the wind. And right after he said that, 1963, November 22nd, we just passed the anniversary, he was assassinated. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is the conclusion of Chapter 27. I will have an announcement about the final exam coming up very shortly. And I will talk to you soon.